Well, hey, Dr. Yanoviak, thank you
Hey.
so much for coming and joining us today. This is our AP biology class. We've got lunchtime here, so a lion lunch and learn. Man, we were super excited. As you guys already know, Dr. Yanoviak is a friend of mine, and he's my favorite biologist. He's a professor at University of Louisville. There he studies with his lab community, behavioral, and evolutionary ecology. Today we're going to ask questions about berry ants and lightning ecology and canopy arthropods and canopy ant diversity, and maybe a little bit about your new study with, shooting some arthropods off catapults. So we can't wait. We're going to rotate around. We've got kind of a microphone here and some prepared questions. So yeah, welcome and thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
You're up.
So, Mr. Yanoviak, I was interested, where did you grow up and how did that kind of get you interested in biology?
Yeah, I can tell you that nobody in my family is at all surprised by what I'm doing today because I've been passionate about biology since I was a kid. My earliest memories are from when I was about 2 years old, walking around in the yard with my mom, just looking at nature, and being impressed by it. So I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and there was a small stream running next to the house that I grew up in, and I spent pretty much every free moment that I had turning rocks over in that stream and being fascinated by all the creatures that I found there, mainly the crayfish, but lots of other things. So I'd come home with buckets full of crayfish and drive my parents crazy. But fortunately for me, they were supportive of it the whole time, and they, never said, "Don't bring that home," or "That's dirty, don't touch it." Instead, they, bought me books about biology from when I was pretty young. So I'm fortunate to have had that experience.
Okay, next question. My name is Mason. Thank you for doing this. But I was wondering where the coolest place you have visited to do research is.
Yeah. So I saw that question. It's a hard one because I've been really fortunate to have traveled to a lot of places in the world that I never thought I'd ever see in my life. And I think if I had to choose one, that was probably the most unique experience, I would say, was Africa. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing when you're working in a forest and you have to worry about elephants. That was something that I really didn't expect. And the entire time that I was doing field work in Africa, I had an armed guard with me because of the dangers from wildlife there. And that was a really unique experience. On a biological side of it, going to a different continent and seeing different species of ants, in this case, we're working with ants, different species, like totally different genera of ants, so really radically different ants that look and behave the same way as the ants I was working on in South America. And so like really seeing what we call convergent evolution in front of your own eyes was really a neat experience for me also.
Oh, can I interrupt real quick? So yeah, we talk about that all the time with convergent evolution and biogeography. Is that something you've brought into your classes too, or is it inform how you see kind of your first love with ants more in Panama and Peru and all that?
So I don't typically talk about convergent evolution in my research so much because it hasn't really been like a major mainstay of my research. It was just sort of an observation that I made that struck me as really interesting. It is something that that I do talk about a little bit, and in the sense that when you see something like gliding behavior in ants in the New World, and then you also see that same behavior in totally unrelated ants in other parts of the world, then that's it's a great example of how we see convergence or perhaps parallel evolution of unique behaviors.
Oh, cool.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and my question is, Was there like a moment or experience you had with like wildlife or nature that stood out to you that like changed your perspective on it?
Yeah. So, um, like I said, I've been interested in biology since I was a kid, and especially arthropods. Um, there, the gliding ant discovery was one of those moments where it's like, wow, um, this is something really neat. And because most of us, as practicing scientists, you kind of go through the motions and you collect your data and you pursue questions. And the majority of people don't ever really discover anything that's exciting beyond the realm of their own lab and or the classroom. And so to make a discovery like that was interesting to everyone from children to grandparents was really fun, and it was a game changer for me. But if you talk about like specific experiences, I remember as a child grabbing a red centipede out of a log I had rolled over and not knowing what it was. And that centipede wrapped itself around my finger and then bit me. And I remember running into the house screaming, and my mom like sprayed it with Bactine, gave me a Band-Aid and all that stuff. But then as negative as that experience was, I suddenly had this amazing appreciation for like the reality of nature in tooth and claw, as they say, right? Um, and that and the first time I pulled some bark off of a log and I saw a real pseudoscorpion. I had no idea what this thing was. I went running into the house. I'm like, Mom, I just saw this, pseudoscorpion, or this scorpion. It looks like a scorpion, but it doesn't have a tail. I don't know what it is. And it wasn't until I got to college actually that I knew what it was. So yeah, it's funny how you look back on your career and your life, and it's like all these little tiny events accumulate into making you who you are today.
Sounds like you still haven't learned your lesson there with the
Hi, my name's Belladonna. I was wondering, what was the weirdest animal you've come across while researching?
So there's a lot of weird stuff out there, and so it's always hard for me to sort of pick like the one thing, but there are some ants that before I started working on ants, I had no idea that these crazy things existed. So there are ants out there that have jaws that are like these super long sickle-shaped things, and they attack other ants with them or other prey. There are ants that have these little hairs all over the body that look like spatulas that you would cook with, and they're sticky, and they use them to glue dirt to the body. And they hang out in leaf litter and soil, and the dirt like makes them look really camouflaged, really hard to see. So little things like that just fascinate me to no end. I almost feel like you could look at anything, and if you look close enough and long enough at it, you're going to realize, wow, every little thing out there has got something special about it that makes it really cool. But the ants, once I started working on ants, I was like, wow, this is amazing. There's such a diversity of behaviors and morphologies. I had no idea.
All right. So, hi, my name's Ava. My question is, how do you balance your roles as a research biologist, teacher, and a science communicator?
So some of that is actually sort of imposed on me externally, because in my job as a college professor, I have an obligation to teach a certain number of classes each semester and each year. And so, that's sort of what they pay me to do, and fundamentally. And so I spend a lot of time preparing those classes and investing a lot in my teaching. But my particular position also has a major research component. So I need to find ways to balance the two. And I wish I could say that, it's very structured and I find that balance, but actually it's not. So I take every day at a time. I look at what my calendar has on it and what I have to get done, and then what do I want to get done. And unfortunately, at this point in my career, the research is kind of like what I want to get done, but don't always get to because I have other obligations. But one of the best things about this job is the freedom that it gives you. So there are days like today when I can take out most of this morning I met with a prospective student this morning before I come in to talk to you, and now I get to talk to you. And so the variety, the diversity of things I get to do on a daily basis are pretty amazing. So, getting back to your question, how do you balance it? It sort of balances itself out. And there are days when I wake up at 5 a.m. and I start working on a manuscript, and it just flows, and the energy is just there, and it's very efficient and productive. And there are days when I don't feel it, and so I have the freedom to focus on teaching that day more than I would on research.
Cool. Hey, I'm gonna jump in here. You sent me a really cool article that your team is publishing about branch landings, simulating from squirrel landings, and yeah, it just seems super cool and kind of tied into what you're saying earlier about being a little kid in the creek and playing with crawfish. I'm wondering kind of the origin of that study. Kind of, is it true how I read it, to where it seems like you brought in play and kind of curiosity and investigation towards it? You're building devices. And I mentioned to the students that, and we showed some of the videos where you had a weighted bag that pulled down a branch and then snapped it up. And then you had the actual in the lab catapult contraption that launched these guys. So yeah, just wondering about kind of curiosity and play, and then kind of how you guys got to thinking about testing that, and what does it show? What are the connections to evolution?
Right. Yeah. So this is I sent you this one because it's kind of the most recent sort of fun, kind of like childish curiosity driven project that we've been working on. And we've been working on this actually for a number of years. It's mostly been driven by students in my lab. And the first person to develop the idea of building this catapult was an undergraduate who worked in my lab a few years ago. He came to me with the idea, and woodworking is one of my hobbies. So I went home and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to build this catapult, and we're going to launch ants. And the idea, the biological idea for this actually comes from the whole gliding ant problem. So the fact that arthropods are up in the trees and they're occasionally falling out of trees, that's a big problem for them. So we started asking the question, well, how well do ants in particular grab onto things like leaves? And what happens if they don't know that that leaf is going to move really suddenly? Like when a squirrel jumps from one branch to another, there's a huge impact. And it translates out to the tips of the leaves. And if there's an ant walking on that leaf, it might just be like launched into space and suddenly have to deal with either gliding or falling. And so the question fundamentally was, what does it take to knock an ant off a leaf? That was the starting point for this. And then we could ask the question, well, okay, what kinds of ants are better at gripping leaves than other ants? And then we expanded that into like arthropods. So, okay, are there certain arthropods that are just really good at hanging on regardless of the disturbance? And because in the tropics, it's about monkeys. Monkeys will jump from tree branch to tree branch, and that's a huge impact. And it's phenomenal when you see it. It's like, wow, that branch really flexes. And I bet everybody on that branch was like launched into space, and they've got to deal with that. So that was the origin of that project, and we had a lot of fun, building catapults and flinging ants around the lab, and it's the kind of science I love to do because it's really curiosity driven, and ultimately it's sort of telling us, that everybody in these trees, because you asked the evolutionary question, but everybody in these trees we've tested, they're all vulnerable. The only insects that aren't vulnerable to falling out when a squirrel moves through their tree is scale insects, because they're actually attached physically to the branches. So anyway, yeah, it's been a fun project and enjoyed working on it. And again, it's mostly student driven in this particular case.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it.
Okay, so I was wondering, what innovative research methods or technologies have you employed in your studies of gliding ants and swimming ants, and how have these enhanced your findings?
So we use a lot of high-speed videography, and that's probably the biggest thing that we've done is try to slow down what we're seeing so we can actually see in more detail what's going on. There is one thing that we did. This was, again, it was led by a student, not by me. He was dropping ants out of a tree in Panama and video recording them as they fell. And he had set up an array of strings with beads on the strings, sort of as almost like a makeshift theater without walls. It was just a bunch of strings hanging out of this tree. And he was able to record the path of the ant through the air relative to the beads on these strings, and then digitally remove the background. So at the end of the day, all he was seeing in his videos was this ant falling in space and going towards a tree trunk. And that was really cool. I thought that was really a neat use of the digital element of videography that we have today. That wasn't, it wasn't the way it was years ago. You had to use real film. We do a lot of fairly high-tech stuff with the Lightning Project, looking at electromagnetic radiation that is really innovative and cutting edge, I would say.
Okay, so how did you first discover that ants can glide, and how far can the average gliding ant glide?
So the gliding ant discovery happened when I was a graduate student, probably back, I think it was about 1998, 99. I was working on a project in trees that in Panama that had no relationship to gliding behavior. It was actually about how ants are foraging on different kinds of food in the canopy. And I had to collect data about every half hour. So basically you put some baits out on a tree branch and then you just wait. And, there's not a lot to do while you're sitting there waiting. So you spend a lot of time looking around. And you also, every now and then I would like drop a pencil or drop a carabiner. And, when you're sitting on a branch that high above the ground, you kind of obsess a little bit about what happens when things fall. And so I just started picking up these ants that were walking around on the branch in front of me and dropping them off the branch. And that's when I noticed that, hey, they're not actually falling. They're actually going places once they get airborne. So that's how that discovery got started. And then it wasn't until years later when I saw it again in Peru that I realized that, okay, there's actually something to this. And then I followed up on it and published it. But yeah, and the second part of your question, let me see, I have it in front of you. Have it in front of me here. How far can they go? So a typical gliding ant will fall about 10 meters, so about 30 feet, and it'll travel maybe 4 or 5 meters, so 15 feet or so horizontally during that process. So it's actually like a controlled fall more than a flat glide into a tree.
Okay. Hi, my name is Macy, and my question was, have ants always had this ability to glide, or have they evolved to have this ability over time?
So yeah, this is something that definitely is an evolved trait. Not all ants have it, and the question becomes, why do some ants have it, and why do some ants not? And that's where the evolutionary question comes in, because you can ask the question, okay, in what cases does gliding behavior actually like benefit the survival of that species, right? So in the case where ants tend to fall or defend themselves and have a good chance of falling, and if that fall ultimately leads to their death, then they've got to find a way to prevent that outcome. And that's not true for all ants. So, for example, if you're an ant that has a nest in the ground, but they spend a lot of time foraging up in trees, up in the canopy, then when they fall out of a tree, they're home again, right? So it's no big deal. So for them, it's not something that you definitely would not expect them to necessarily evolve gliding behavior. And that's exactly what we see. So things like leafcutter ants that nest in the ground but forage up in the trees don't glide. Whereas ants that have pretty expensive workers that hang out up in the trees and they nest in the trees, they're the ones that are gliding.
Hey, real quick, can you give us an indication or maybe a guess at what percentage of species are just in the tree?
So roughly, let's say 30% of
Okay.
species hang out in trees. Now, that's if you go to a place like Costa Rica, and this is where they've actually measured this. So they've done really thorough inventories of ant species diversity in some forests in Costa Rica, and roughly there's like 500 ant species there in total, and about 150 to 200 of those are canopy ant species.
Really?
So less than half, but more than 25%, somewhere in that realm there.
Okay.
Hi, so my question is, for gliding ants, is gliding used as a defensive or offensive tactic, or both?
It's mostly defensive. So these ants are just trying to survive, and they might use it in relationship to an offensive context. So if the colony is being attacked by an anteater or something that's tearing it apart, or a monkey sitting on a branch and they're upset by that, then they will potentially attack that monkey or that anteater. And in the process of doing that, the anteater might brush them off and they would fall. And so the gliding behavior then becomes this defensive tactic where they're just trying to survive and protect themselves against becoming food for lizards or frogs in the understory, or fish if it's a flooded forest. Yeah.
So my question is, how did you discover berry ants and how common are they?
So the berry ants were discovered by my colleague, and this all started when we made the gliding ant discovery, and some people picked up on it. So the BBC and National Geographic, they all wanted to video record this for TV shows, and so they went down. They invited us to go down to Panama and basically demonstrate the behavior to them, and so they could film it. And my colleague Robert went down to Panama a week before me, and his job was to collect some ants so that when I got there with the film crew, that we'd be ready to go and have some specimens for them. So Robert goes down and he's there for a day or two, and he's like, "Hey, I found the ants, and why are they red?" And I was like, they're not red. You must have found the wrong species of ant. This couldn't possibly be the right ant. But I was like, okay, I don't know. It must be, some variation I've never seen before. So I get down there and I find these ants, and sure enough, they're bright red on the rear end. And it's like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And I took them into the lab and just started poking around with them. And I realized that red rear end, so the gaster of the ant, I have my model ant here for you. I can show you. So this rear end of the ant, there's his head, her head. This rear end just turns bright red and it falls off real easy. So I noticed all these things about it, and I started poking it under the microscope, and out poured all these nematode eggs. And so that was when this discovery is like, this is amazing. Nobody probably ever thought about this before. In fact, people had seen these berry ants before, like going back to the late 1800s, and they thought it was just a different color variety of that species. They never bothered to break it open and see what was causing it to change color. So that was really a neat outcome for us.
Hi, I'm Andrew. Do the ants resemble a certain berry, or can they resemble multiple berries?
So they're probably resembling any red berry in the forest. There is one tree species called Hieronima that has red berries that are the approximate size and shape of these ant gasters. So that's the closest berry I could find in terms of being a good model for this mimicry. But if you walk through the forest and you look at berries in tropical rainforest, there's a lot of them that are red. And if all you're trying to do is confuse a bird for one split second, then there's lots of opportunities to make that mistake.
My question is, why do berry ants as parasites facilitate transmission to subsequent hosts? Do they have to switch to the next host to stay alive, or is it for offspring survival?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they're trying to avoid inbreeding. The idea here is that if you're a parasite in one ant colony and you never get to meet and mate with parasites from another ant colony, then you're at an evolutionary dead end, because all you're doing is inbreeding with your own offspring eventually, and your sisters and brothers, right? Now these are nematodes, so I'm kind of exaggerating here, but those nematodes need to mate with nematodes that are genetically different from them, but still the same species. And the only way you can do that, we call this outcrossing. The only way you can do that is by getting introduced to individuals from other ant colonies. And birds are the perfect way to do that because they fly. And so you can take nematodes from one colony and move them to another colony in your feces if you're a bird, and that's exactly what they're doing. So that's basically how that works, and why it works is they really need to outcross. They need to avoid inbreeding.
Hi, my name is Reagan, and my question is, how could a parasite change the appearance of an ant, and how can this parasite and other parasites manipulate their hosts?
Yeah, so you know the story of the berry ants that causes the ant's rear end to turn red. It also has some behavioral effects on the ant and other morphological effects on the ant, but it's not the only example of this. So there are some parasites out there that cause the ants in general to turn lighter color. So they're almost like an albino version of an ant in a colony. And it's thought that when a woodpecker or like a flicker or some other insectivorous bird that pecks away at dead wood, when it encounters this ant colony, it's going to see those white colored workers really easily. And so it's going to pick them off preferentially. And then that parasite then infects the bird, or, and like in the case of the berry ants, gets transmitted to a new ant colony somehow. So there are cases where parasites are causing ants to get lighter in color. There are cases where it causes the ant to be expanded, be large, just by virtue of having this body that's full of parasites. There's a case of an ant out in the western U.S. in Arizona in a desert. I had a student work on this for a little while, and the ant is generally quite orange in color, and when it's infected with the parasites, it turns more of a clear kind of whitish color. And these ants then get eaten by horned lizards, and then the lizards get infected with the nematode inside the ant. So there are lots of little examples like that. And if you get outside of the world of ants, there are others that do really amazing things. One of the famous ones is a parasite that causes the antennae of a snail to look like caterpillars, right? And so they get picked off by birds as well. And lots of other examples of that.
Okay, so my name's Reese, and my question is, how did you discover that lianas help protect trees from lightning, and how do they do this?
Yeah, so the evidence is still incomplete on this question. So we don't know yet if lianas are actually protecting trees or if they may actually be harming more trees. And I can take a step back and tell you that the reason that lianas might be protecting trees is in part because of the way that liana stems grow. So they tend to hold a lot of water, and the more water you have, the more conductive you are. And more conductive objects are going to be basically lightning rods, right? So we use metal for lightning rods, typically copper or steel or something like that. It's going to be conductive. And so in the first place, lianas are more conductive than tree stems are. So presumably if lightning struck a tree that had a liana in it, the current would travel through the liana because it's the path of least resistance. The second thing about lianas is that they tend to be the tallest things in the forest. And this was something that I never realized until I started working on this project. And I started looking at the forest canopy. We spent a lot of years climbing trees in Panama, looking at the forest canopy. And I noticed that, we tend to think of tree crowns as being the top of the forest. But if you look really closely at a tree crown, if it has a liana in it, there's little stems that stick up all out of that tree crown. And those are liana tendrils that are trying to get more light. And so if lightning comes down and strikes a tree, it's probably going to hit one of those tendrils before it hits the tree itself. So that was the second reason we thought, okay, lianas are probably getting struck more often than trees and probably providing protection for the trees by being lightning rods. What we have found doesn't really give like clear support for that so far. Lightning is weird in tropical forests. In the temperate forest, in Florida, for example, where you have pine forest, lightning will strike an individual pine tree. It leaves a nice, very clear scar on that tree. The tree probably dies within 6 months or so from beetles that attack it. In the rainforest, lightning strikes a big tree, and it actually spreads out through the crowns of like 5 other trees at the same location. So the typical lightning strike in Panama kills between 5 and 6 trees. You get these clusters of death. If there are lianas in those trees, the lianas tend to carry the current down to trees in the understory. So trees that are like, shoulder height, that normally wouldn't be killed because you get this umbrella effect. Lightning strikes the canopy and then it grounds out through all these trees, and it's like a Faraday cage. But the lianas involve more of the small saplings because of their presence there. So it's complicated. It's like so many things in nature. You go into it and you're like, okay, I've got this idea. It should be simple. And then we go out and look at it and it's like, nah, nature is way more complicated than we thought.
Okay, so my next question is there a difference in trees from regions that suffer a lot of lightning strikes versus trees in regions with less lightning strikes?
Yeah, we would like to know the answer to that, and we're working on that, actually. So there are places in the world that are called lightning hotspots. And Panama gets a lot of lightning. South Florida gets a lot of lightning, right? So Orlando is like the lightning capital of the United States. Interestingly enough, Western Kentucky gets a lot of lightning. But if you really, really want to study or see a place where there's a lot of lightning, I mean a lot, like a lightning hotspot, you have to go to Central Africa in the Congo, or Western Colombia in a place called the Chocó, or the west edge of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Now, if you know anything about politics and geography, the Congo, Western Colombia, and Venezuela are all politically very difficult places for Americans to work. And so we have not been able to do much just in those lightning hotspot areas. But getting back to your question, yes, if what we're showing with our work in Panama actually translates to a broader tropical forest patterns around the world, then we would expect that places that have high lightning frequency should have fairly predictable tree species composition. So lightning, where it's really, really common, should be affecting the structure of the forest.
My next question is, are there some trees that have evolved to be less harmed by lightning strikes?
Yes. Yeah, and so this is work that we haven't published yet, but hopefully will get out soon. We've noticed in Panama, it's hard. It's hard stuff to answer with data because there's like 400 different species of trees in the place we work in Panama, and so if you have 100 lightning strikes and you have more species of trees than you have lightning strikes, then you may not get any replication. You know what I mean? You could have 100 lightning strikes that could all strike a different tree species, and you could never answer the question, are some species resistant? Well, fortunately for us, we have 9. So we've been working with a database of about 100 strikes, and 9 of them have all been on the same species of tree. And in every case, the tree survived. In fact, it had very little damage. The other 90 strikes that we've recorded have been scattered among a variety of different species. But these 9 strikes are really interesting because this tree survives, and it seems like the lightning is killing everything around the tree, but not the tree itself, which would mean that it reduces the competition for that tree. So actually lightning could be benefiting that one tree species.
My question is, have more frequent storms due to climate change impacted the tree species' resistance to lightning?
It should, but the effects of climate change are happening faster than the evolutionary patterns in trees. And so we should see if the only thing that changes with climate change is increased lightning frequency, then we can make some predictions about how that's going to affect the forest structure and the composition of the forest. The problem is when you talk about resistance in trees, that is something that takes millions of years to evolve. And the rate that climate change is affecting lightning frequency is happening too fast for them to evolve at the same time with that. So we won't see that. We won't see that in terms of resistance. We could see changes in forest composition of trees if lightning strike frequency increases. This is very complicated again because all the factors that affect the frequency of lightning also affect things like drought or other patterns. The frequency of strong storms with a lot of wind that also can knock down trees. And so there's a lot of potentially confounding variables involved.
Hello, my name is William, and my question is, how will the fitness of canopy ants be affected by the removal or addition of lianas?
Yeah, so lianas provide little bridges between trees in the canopy. And so if your main goal as an ant is to gather resources from your environment to feed your colony, then the presence of lianas could have fitness effects for different species in the trees. Because if you take away the lianas, then the ants don't have easy access to resources outside of their home tree. In order to get to another tree, they'd have to go all the way to the ground, crawl through the leaf litter, and then go up the trunk of another tree nearby to get to, I don't know, pollen or some fruit or something else that they want. And so the lianas definitely have fitness benefits for ants. It is incredibly hard to measure that benefit, but that is the working assumption, yes.
Hi, okay. So how do ants in these treetops work together versus ants on the ground?
So I think there's probably not a lot of difference in how they function up in the canopy versus on the ground. What is interesting about it, though, is that everything that they do in the canopy is more constrained physically. Because if you're in a leaf litter, you can just wander over. I mean, it's complicated, right? Leaf litter is really complex if you're a tiny organism. And trying to navigate through all that, I can't imagine what that's like. But when you're up in the canopy, you might have fewer obstacles, but you have all of your pathways are really linear because all you can do is walk on branches and lianas, so vines. Whereas in the understory, in the leaf litter, you've got this sort of complexity that you have to navigate, but it's pretty much everywhere around you. And so that's the difference.
Well, Steve, our bell just rang.
All right.
This is awesome. We really appreciate your time and expertise. So thanks so much.
Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely the best. So yeah, if you were in 4th period, I'll see you later. If you're in 5th period, hang out. Cool, man. Yeah, I look forward to seeing more of your work. I did have one question, though.
Yeah.
For kind of second to last question, where we're looking at evolution of the tree species and climate change. So if you have, climate change heating up, and you have, plant and animal species migrating, to the poles a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine that's just another confounding variable, like the speed of climate change, the speed of the march north and south. Is that something you would be able to measure or take into account?
People are anticipating that, and when I say people, I really mean foresters. So if you look at like the Canadian Forestry Commission, and I don't know exactly what their official title is, but the forestry industry in Canada has started planting more southern species at more northern latitudes because they're in anticipation of different climates up there than they have right now. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that in a practical sense, people are preparing for it.
Right. Okay.
And you know, so they're almost preemptively expanding the ranges of these
really?
commercially good species, right?
Oh, right.
But if you look at, so I think it's the U.S. Forest Service, the USDA, has a really cool website that shows like the historical range of American beech and then the future range of American beech based on climate change.
Yeah.
And you're already seeing some of that happening. And of course, you know, changes in distribution happen faster than evolutionary processes, right? So, you know, over a period of decades, those seedlings that are growing up north have higher survivorship than the ones growing in the south, for example. And so you can see that in a human lifespan. But the evolution of lightning resistance, you would not see in a human lifespan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And last, any recommendations for us or for me, books or anything you think would be awesome that you're into these days?
There's a relatively new book out called Guests of Ants, and it's all about things that live with ants that are not ants.
Really?
That's a fun one. Yeah. Now that's a technical book. That's a science text.
Sure.
So it may be kind of dry, but it's, you know, for me, it's exciting just to see all the really cool stuff that lives with ants.
All right. When's your book coming out?
When I retire, I'll take some time to write a book. How about that?
Awesome. All right, Steve. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks again. It's a great pleasure. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah. See you soon. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.